Hello, I'm here to talk about Dorn again. Why? Because Dorn is 100% coming back. Is that true? No. This is about the recent breathlessness in the past week, which has had some people foaming at the mouth again about ROGAL Dorn, because a Black Templar had a dream. Well, hang on now, okay. We don't want to be too sarcastic because, as we already know, in 40k, dreams and visions are always rock-solid locks for future revelations and events. Anyway, now, I didn't fall over myself to make a video about this because, and I know this might be shocking for you, I wanted to wait for the actual novel to release so that I could, read it, that being Fulgrim the Perfect Son, before jumping to conclusions or just making assumptions based on a leaked excerpt taken out of context and without the framing of any following explanations or events. That seems pretty reasonable to do, which is what I've done. What's the result? It's somewhat ambiguous and open to interpretation, so 40k basically. Now, from here on, I need to say that you can expect many spoilers about the book Fulgrim the Perfect Son, and I say that because it only released this past week. But as you know, for me personally, spoilers are not a thing in 40k. I don't care about spoilers in any order, form, whatever, because when you know right from the start that the Emperor ends up on the throne, you're pretty much just filling in the gaps after that. So, spoilers. There are several things in the book which undermine this idea of a predicted return by Dorn, if it even is a prediction, which lean towards suggesting that this revelatory vision is even manipulation of the Templar in question, Berengar, by Fulgrim. I also want to note that given time pressures, I often scan read material, and while I'm fairly practiced at this, where I can basically just scan through pages, let my eyes hit keywords, and then discern if a chapter is relevant to what I'm talking about, thinking about, or not, it's possible I might miss something, but overall, for what I want to discuss, I think it's pretty straightforward. There's only a few elements that are really relevant. The overall summary is that basically, we follow some Templars defending a world against an onslaught of chaos, some Imperial Guard, etc. This Black Templar early on emerges as the Emperor's champion, and he uses that channeled faith and force of the Emperor multiple times. We see some 3rd Legion members vying for the favour of Fulgrim, and it's this rolling on and off series of encounters, where Berengar the Templar has several interactions, battles with the traitor Marines. There's plenty of moments where Fulgrim is being demony and standard chaos, trying to tempt others, pitting typical heretics against one another for an all but meaningless ascension of status. But before we go on, I recently noted a while ago in my video about Slaanesh that I hadn't really been bowled over by how that Chaos God is generally represented, and I think in terms of this novel, it's not any exception there. There's not too much in here that's really the lowest levels of filth you could imagine when it comes to Slaanesh, the most base forms of sensory experience. There's some cool little bits and pieces in there, but nothing crazy. But in saying that, I want to remind that Slaanesh is not just about sexual excess. It's pretty much any form of experience, and this often leads toward whatever is considered perfection. Again, I would go back and check out my Slaanesh video if you haven't, I've linked it on screen. But Slaanesh can be this wide spectrum of excesses, and that's something less explored when it comes to Traitor Astartes followers, except for the likes of Noise Marines. And again, I referenced that in the Slaanesh video, where there is a really cool older book where we see this human individual. She's been absolutely corrupted by the powers, the cults of Slaanesh, and she's presiding over this world where down below they're sort of collecting materials, jewels, and so on for her, but it's done in this really excessive, debased way, and she's sort of watching down from above, kind of corrupted an entire planet. It's very cool, and it's sort of more what you imagine to be Slaanesh. But overall, this novel is pretty solid. I really enjoyed the two Heretic Astartes playing off against one another. Fulgrim felt very powerful, very sort of, as you would expect for a demon Primarch, ascendant above it all. The Templars surrounding Berengar I found to be a bit forgettable, but overall the Emperor's Champion, the named traitor marines were very memorable. I'd recommend this. I thought it was a worthwhile, enjoyable addition to framing contemporary traitor Astartes, and I didn't find it lagged or was slow like sometimes can occur. This was a good page-turning novel, so yeah, I would check it out. So let's move on though to the real meat of today, what we're talking about. What's all this deal with ROGAL Dorn? So we're going to need to rake through all the evidence. Oh, I don't care, Lutin, that's all boring. Don't you remember when you said Dorn was dead? Did I? Let's have a look then, because I can't actually remember what I said last time. There remains an ongoing presumption within the lore of the 41st millennium that the Primarch of the Imperial Fists is dead. However, it is also true that like many things that span the bridge of time between the end of the heresy and the Indomitus era of the Imperium, all that has occurred across this void remains very often unclear or immersed in the deeply muddied waters of Imperial records. But then you have ROGAL Dorn, the Praetorian of Terror, Primarch of the Imperial Fists. Dorn stands alone and separate from the other Primarchs, to my mind, because his situation is considerably more unclear, and there is arguably enough material out there that he could be alive or dead. Oh, so I guess I didn't actually say he's dead. What I said was there's a presumption and that he could be dead or alive. It's always funny to me how even though you can say things with absolute clarity, there's always people who just hear what they want to hear. Anyway, whatever. So what's all this about this vision where the Templar 100% sees Dorn and so on? Well, it's less convincing than has been presented, in my opinion. Shocking, I know. Here's why. And again, many spoilers here in terms of detail and context. So Berengar, the Black Templar, has this vision early in the novel. He sees himself on a battlefield and gives a description of what appear to be Sorotas above, Imperial Fists present, Templars. It's possibly suggesting that this is a contemporary Imperial setting. He describes seeing the Primarch himself, and then he hears a voice, which very importantly is written in italic bold, "My son." Now what is important here is that Berengar notes that he is unsure who this voice belongs to. He wonders, is it Dorn, or Sigismund, or someone else? Another point to note is that he describes how what hand had plucked him from prayer and brought him here to this eternal battlefield. An eternal battlefield, wearing armor that is not his own. These kind of descriptions alone give us pause to question and wonder where and when this is occurring, or if it's even real, or is it some fabrication or some manifestation. And this becomes especially relevant when we learn of his fate later on. If anything, it's possible he's seeing himself fighting some kind of ethereal, eternal battle, some kind of spirit form, a war in the eternal void perhaps, alongside Dorn, and so on. Maybe duty does not end in death, is basically what I'm saying. He hears this voice again, "My warrior," in bold italic. He notes that the voice is unmistakably divine. The warm golden light shines upon him with holy purpose, but he also notes that this takes shape around a figure that refused to commit itself to a single form, a faceless incarnation, which loses cohesion every time he chooses to look directly upon it. One paragraph saying, "Was it Dorn himself who led the battle cry?" It's a question. Importantly, he cannot tell. Then noting, the shapeless horror opened its arms in greeting, and with dreamlike clarity, what he had taken for a man-sized enemy was 3, 4 times, no 10, a dozen times larger. The great coil of a serpent's belly. It's basically Fulgrim. He hears words spoken to him again, for us in the form of that same bold italic, "My champion." Now you'd be forgiven for thinking that that is potentially Dorn or the Emperor or some kind of, imperial spirit speaking to him. He sees another warrior appear, he stabs through it with his blade, and then he returns to reality. He's roused by his Castellan. Now, most notable are his first words after this, "Crucible." And when asked what he means by this, he says, "a world." In his internal thoughts, he can see this place clearly after the vision, and he says a battleground where we shall fight the war to come. Then lastly, when exiting the vision, he describes how Dorn himself was there. I fought alongside him beneath the blessed angels of the God Emperor, and that we fought the Neverborn, Heretic, Astartes. So it all seems pretty solid, nice and locked down, right? I mean, if you think so, but to me, it's all pretty weak stuff. Because 5 chapters later, we see how Berenger is suddenly not feeling as strong or clear about this vision. Their defensive conflict that is now not progressing well finds Berenger struggling to free himself from the sense of pride alone at having been sent here as the Emperor's champion, yet now they find themselves struggling to withstand the onslaught, and this is greatly troubling him. It's almost as if something manipulated them to come here. The Emperor's champion describes through his internal dialogue how, in the vision, the dream that still haunted him every night, he was a warrior striding across the battlefield in the footsteps of his Primarch with sword in hand. In the vision, he was an instrument of death, the God Emperor's wrath given flesh, sure and certain of his purpose. And on waking, all of that faded to nothing. Now, I don't know about you, but that last line is pretty devastating language. On waking, all of that faded to nothing. Now, it's necessary for me to make a brutal spoiler here, and even though I've said it already, I'm giving full disclosure to jump forward or mute for a moment because the end of this story is relevant. So I'm about to say it. Berengar dies brutally, and the heretics are victorious. Now, this is a story that is far more about Fulgrim than it is Templars, which might be shocking considering the novel is titled Fulgrim. It's a story about manipulation, the pursuit of perfection in the name of Slaanesh, and the impossibility of ever satisfying one such as Fulgrim. It's the core story between the two major heretic characters, and Berengar falls into this as well. When you understand that context, it helps frame the opening vision, not to mention the fact that it appears to be Fulgrim speaking to him, perhaps deliberately manipulating him. And just to remove all doubt, I also bothered to hit up the audiobook, and in the opening vision by Berengar, the voice which he cannot define is also the voice used by the narrator later for Fulgrim. So now, if you had just read that leaked excerpt, you could have been forgiven for thinking that the words spoken in the bold italic were those of, like I said, Dorn, the Emperor, or whatever. You might also have considered that where he describes a battleground where we shall fight the war to come is referencing an actual future event to come in this narrative via his vision, or if not here, then something else in the future, maybe even years from now, where he himself is with Dorn fighting the Chaos Traitors. He also talks about following in Dorn's footsteps, which you could take literally, or you could take it that he simply was seeing a kind of imagined projection of Dorn and is, following in the footsteps, which is most often how that phrase is used. Because sadly, reality is about to come crashing down. Throughout the novel, Fulgrim always speaks in bold italic, never anybody else. So it's quite apparent that the words being spoken to Berengar are from Fulgrim. Crucible is where they will end up fighting a siege over in this novel, and importantly, via this conflict is where they attempt to tempt Berengar to join them. There are, though, still some things which are, of course, less clear. Firstly, Berengar does continue to have visions throughout this journey and does seem genuinely blessed by the Emperor in the traditional manner by which a Templar becomes the Emperor's champion. So is Fulgrim intruding in on a true vision here? It's possible. It's also possible that the Emperor's champion is not truly channeling the Emperor, but more is imbued by the power of faith, as we see with the Sororitas, which is notable because in several instances where he requests the Emperor to fortify his strength, nothing really happens. When he does have it though, he tends to be on something more like a rampage comparable to the Black Rage, but in the form of faith. In his original vision, he sees what appear to be Sororitas, but we don't have them notably present here for this conflict. So then could it be that Berengar is foreseeing something in the future, or could it be just a vision that is a bizarre convergence of past and future? Unknown. Lastly, there is the possibility that he's seeing a real event through the eyes of someone else, perhaps a future Emperor's champion. and this is where the ambiguity is. But it's equally likely that this is just something put forward by Fulgrim, seeing as we hear him in that vision. But we hear nothing further spoken, certainly not that could be implied or interpreted as the Emperor or Dorn himself, nor is he present in any kind of other visions throughout the novel. The vision is not encountered again, to the point that even Berengar himself begins to feel unsure about it. Now, I'm not going to just reiterate everything from my previous video where we spoke to the status of Dorn, but a couple of points that I always like to imagine are obvious, but apparently not always are, and so I find myself forced to cover them. So 1. In truth, I don't have much of a beef with Dorn. He's not a favourite for me. I find him to be just pretty bland. It's like me in the Tower. It's fun to dunk on them, but basically, whatever. It's fun to just have that banter with your mates in 40k, and this can get absolutely lost in translation when you transition to the online world. Despite my personal feelings though, Dorn is objectively an amazing character. His story is epic during and up to the end of the heresy. His wandering the desert is bleak. His reflections about having to ruin the Palace of Terror in sake of its own defense are very sincere, and they provide us with perspective about how the Loyalists felt about their undertaking in this era, which is all very fitting and insightful as to his stalwart approach to all things. But accompanying that, and as with pretty much all Primarchs, there are some things which are less positive. His rage and inability to approach things with more objective rationality, as per Guilliman, for example. You could well imagine that if he had just killed Nathaniel Garrow, as he threatened to do, that would have been a ridiculous and catastrophic waste, and quite honestly, just a little bit silly that somebody so entrusted with such responsibility and power could lose control of themselves so easily, and it's this kind of thing which makes Dorn not particularly a favourite for me. At the same time, as I've said before, the final chapter of Dorn's story as it exists so far in the lore is confusing, and not confusing in a good way either. It's not even particularly intriguing, it's really just a bit of a mess. But this is attributed really to the fact that it comes from an era where seemingly concern for future developments was not a particularly high priority. The Index Astartes speaks about Dorn acquiring this store of goodwill in service to the High Lords of Terror, but that was during the era of apostasy, which occurs in M36, a long time after the heresy. The picture becomes even more confusing in that Dorn's final sighting is said to have been aboard a despoiler-class ship, which were first seen in M36, so those two details align. But it's also described how this occurred after the disappearance of Corax, where the Fists aid against one of the first Black Crusades with Dorn and their fortress the Phalanx, along with the majority of the chapter. Dorn is said to have made his final stand aboard the Sword of Sacrilege ship, leading a final desperate assault, and then this is where they famously recover his fist, all they're able to discover of his remains. But that occurs basically in M31, or the later period of M31. His hand ends up becoming one of their holiest relics, and that's how things stand. But then we also see Vulcan later make an offhand reference to Dorn during the War of the Beast in M32, speaking to Captain Corland of the Imperial Fists, that he would speak well of them to ROGAL Dorn. It's really just another oddity of timing, and it does little to alter much of the perspective seen from M41. But again, much of this really could be attributed to the bizarrity of time in the galaxy, and that's pretty in line with what Guilliman saw when he returned eventually, because he could just see that the weird timings of stuff in the warp just didn't really work and nothing was very reliable. The bottom line is, overall, it just leaves Dorn's status being pretty ambiguous. Nobody really knows exactly when he disappeared or where and why. But the most commonly referenced piece of lore that we also get related is when Conrad Kurz of the Night Lords had a vision of Dorn's death, which further supports not only his later descriptions, but also the fact that this is something that Kurz has seen, and that's a reference 4 years prior to the Kurz Primarchs novel. But the vision is something I always see people mention about but never remember where it is actually from. But I'll tell you, it comes from the novella The Prince of Crows, which was first seen in the Heresy anthology Shadows of Treachery, and it later came out as an audio short as well. And that's where we get the actual vision of Dorn from Kurz. His fellow Primarchs arrive upon his homeworld with the Emperor, and it describes how the first demigod, clad in rough gold, inclined his white hair head in majestic acknowledgement. A king greeting an equal. "I am ROGAL Dorn," he said. The Night Haunter said nothing. In his mind's eye, he saw the giant die, dragged down by 100 murderers in a dark tunnel, their knives and swords wet with warriors' blood. Now for me, that's pretty clear cut. But it is of course important to bear in mind this is a precognitive vision from Kurz which aligns with the last sighting of Dorn. But despite this, it must be said that Kurz was cursed by always seeing the worst possible outcomes in his visions, because he's seeing quite far into the future, and as we've discussed previously, this is where the concept of time and the strands of fate, or as Emperor in the Malcador would have it, their configurations, are relevant to unfolding events. Nonetheless, Kurz is fairly reliable when it comes to his visions, but they're still visions nonetheless, and they still fall into the same ballpark of unreliability that I'll speak about shortly. One other small thing, it's a regularity, but specifically in the Imperial Fists Codex 8th edition, where it restates that Dorn's hand was the only remnant of the Primarch, but it also noted his status as being unknown. But as I've stated previously, I always consider any factional codex to have an element of bias and point of view which leans toward their own for any faction, so given that it's within the Fists Codex, I think it holds some narrative bias there. Now, is Conrad Kurz reliable? It's debatable, but I think a general overarching theme with Kurz is his need to reaffirm his worldview through the despicable nature of humanity, and this also extends to his own visions. The point being, the descriptions Kurz gives in relation to Dorn do little to alter his own view, in the sense that it's not a particularly dark or holding larger commentary vision that he has, other than, I suppose, humanity just being able to turn against these miraculous beings and slaughter them. Basically, is Dorn's death so significant that Kurz would need this to be true? In the sense of, would he manipulate it in his mind's eye? It's pretty debatable. But no more so than a Templar having such a vision, which might have been earth-shattering if there hadn't already been others with their own conflicting visions 10 years prior. And that's pretty much where we end up, which leaves me only to continue to talk about Diegesis. Now many might say, and reasonably so, that you could interpret Kurz's vision in a different way. It also could be unreliable. And how do we know that? Because of Diegesis. So what's that? Well, it's something I've talked about multiple times across many videos now, and it's why when people say, "Oh, stop repeating things you've said before," well, apparently I have to, because some people seemingly just don't get it, even though it's pretty bloody simple. It connects directly to the fact that in 40k there's no strict principle of canonicity like you see in other verses, and as I've said repeatedly and as confirmed by multiple Games Workshop authors, because obviously there are established facts. You just have to use different parameters to establish them, which for me is where Diegesis comes in. Basically, the more physically evident something is, the more reliable it is. It's pretty simple, but even then, never fully reliable. But that's 40k, love it or hate it. Diegesis is basically the internal space of a fictional world. In a loose sense, it's the immersive world. It encompasses all elements that exist and occur within this space, such as characters, events, dreams, conversations, and the environment as perceived by the characters themselves. This immersive lens through which we see a verse is how I personally try to approach the lore of 40k, something that I've again made pretty clear early on, in the sense that I try to most often view things from what we know internally, not externally, without the contamination of knowing, say, that Games Workshop want to release XYZ. I find it to be less soul-destroying that way. Now, most people understand this concept in relation to movies. For example, diegetic sound includes any audio which originates from within a story world. This could be dialogue between characters, ambient noise, sound from a device, whereas non-diegetic sound refers to elements like a film score, voiceover narration that characters cannot hear. The reason that diegesis is important to understand with 40k is that it helps to distinguish between what belongs to a character's reality and what is added for the reader or viewer's experience, because those things can be very different and can entirely shape how viewers interpret a story, its events, and its structure. More importantly though, I believe in the context of 40K, it also enables us to decide how much weight and reliability to place on certain things. For example, the narrator is outside the narrative world. This is what they call the extra diegetic. Characters don't hear their descriptions of the environment around them. They don't hear the descriptions and actions that are being told of others. In the context of diegesis, a dream or a vision would be considered at best unreliable because it exists at a secondary layer within the narrative. This is what's known as meta-diegetic. It's essentially a fiction from a fictional character within the story. They are telling or remembering something, or they're having a vision or a dream. Thereby, it doesn't adhere to the same rules which govern the primary diegetic reality, which comes from the author. Dreams and visions are shaped by a character's subconscious. And yes, obviously the author's writing that, but if they're writing it, they should be writing it from the context and perspective of that character. It's coming from their subconscious. It's their desires, their fears, their associations, the other factors that are occurring in that fictional world, including, say, manipulation by third parties, thereby making those things inherently unreliable. Now, if that's not clear, think of it like this. Our own memories are unreliable. We often blur, redefine, we allow elements of our memory to be, say, brighter than they really were at the time. For many, even remembering details about events that happened to us hours or days before can be very difficult. Now imagine this in the context of a fictional world. Dreams and visions stand in direct contrast to events that happened in the main diegetic world, because the consequences of such things are very immediate, but more importantly, they're observably tangible. Coherence is expected there, whereas dreams can shift, settings can abruptly snap and change, features and events that would be impossible in reality can occur, and this includes characters behaving in contradictory or fantastical ways. Not to mention, again, outside influences potentially manipulating someone. And that's really baked into the nature of 40K as well, making any such visions thereby even more unreliable than they might otherwise be. This lack of internal logic or grounding in a shared reality renders them at the very least untrustworthy as sources of factual information within the story. But to be absolutely clear, this doesn't mean they're not valuable to us. They certainly can be very interesting, exciting, they can be speculative, they can open up doors of possibility. But that's about all. They more broadly will serve as psychological or thematic devices than as literal plot developments, because they can mislead both characters and audience about what is real in the diegetic sense. Which is why I'm always so genuinely baffled when I see people jumping straight onto anything as written, even if it's dreams and visions, and they basically are like, bam, case closed, I saw the words. That's not how it works. It's bizarre, and it really just suggests a fundamental misunderstanding of how the 40K world works, because rarely is anything so clear-cut, least of all a temporary reality projected in the mind of an in-fiction character. And then of course I have to mention, because if I don't somebody else will, the stark brightness of daylight, the cold hard reality that is the real deal of Games Workshop, channeling their best Mr. Krabs, Primarch miniature equals profit. I know that's a lot to take in mentally, so I'm just going to let that sink in with you, because that's some pretty big thinking there. If there's any Orc players, you're getting a headache from such a big concept, you can go ahead, lean against the wall, take some deep breaths. Quite obviously, Primarchs are money. There's no revelation here, this is just abundantly evident. It's in fact why I made my previous video decrying the possibility of just all Primarchs returning. And I think what's interesting is that I actually see more people than not who are actually on the same page here. Most of the community that I see and engage with seem to agree that having just all Primarchs returning would be a little silly and just kind of undermine the world that's been created as things stand in 40K. Nobody really wants to see it. And I'm going to go out on a limb and say it as well. there's a percentage of me that isn't even that happy about the return of Guilliman and the Lion. And meanwhile, poor Yarrick gets a small written paragraph on page 6. By the way, legendary character is gone. It's disrespectful. Anyway, pin a page there for my Yarrick's Not Dead video. But yeah, many people say that the Primarchs are this thing you're keeping in your back pocket for a sales slump. You got to roll it out and score a win. But here's the thing, that's not how it works. Which is another thing which also often confuses me. I see people say stuff like, oh, they just waited to release this model because it's a quiet period, a bit of a downturn. As far as I know, models and all the lore stuff is planned years in advance. They're not just banging stuff out month to month. So the idea that this is somehow reactive is just nonsensical. Now, maybe they have a plan where it's more sort of like just periodically dropped in spaces evenly, so it kind of, creates like, okay, things are coming down a bit, and then they come up, and then down a bit, and then back up. That makes more sense. But that's why I advocate against some kind of steady plan, which sees Primarchs returning at these staged intervals. Because sometimes it's not all about the money. Now, I hear you all laughing, and I do admit, I am perhaps being naive and idealistic, but we have often seen entire IPs destroyed in recent times just for this endless grabbing pursuit of profit at any cost, either through just hammering out too much content that saturates an audience's interest, i.e. all the superhero movies, or say forcing through new material for the sake of profit with no willingness to take real narrative risks or bold decisions within it, say Star Wars. And as much as I enjoyed the more serious tone and pace of something like Andor, it's still the same bloody story they've been milking for 50 years. And all of this was my primary reasoning for suggesting previously that Dorn should stay dead. He's dead in the narrative sense. He's missing in action. He's gone. He's out of the picture. And as I said before now, it's not just about Dorn. I don't know why people get so hung up on this Dorn thing. It's applicable to many other characters where you just don't need or want to see them come back, because narratively they carry more weight and power in staying absent. And that's a good thing. It's positive. It's just, as I explained, I thought pretty clearly last time around. But anyway, here's another example which just came into my head.
He says you then lost your nerve and ran from a small French patrol. He says you lost 10 men, a major, and 2 sergeants. He says you finally lost your sense of honor and destroyed the bridge, cutting off a rescue party led by Lieutenant Sharp. He says you lost the king's colors.
The fault was not mine, sir. Major Lennox must answer.
Major Lennox answered with his life, as you should have done if you had any sense of honor. You lost the colors of the King of England. You disgraced us, sir. You shamed us, sir. You will answer.
Now this is the renowned, powerful scene from the Sharp series. Imagine they added a black screen with text a little after that scene being like, Major Lennox returned 6 months later, turned out he didn't die, actually it was all fine. No matter how much you want them to return, it undermines these powerful stories and characters. Now, admittedly, sometimes a returning character can be powerful, certainly. It can shift the weight of events. Look at Guilliman. It can open up new avenues to explore, and it can create a foundation to build upon in the contemporary setting of a verse. But it's also about the integrity and the strength of the narrative storytelling. You can't chip that away too much, because then things start to collapse. It's this sense that when we see somebody is gone, that hits pretty hard because you know it's established, it's going to be fairly permanent. And that is something that people genuinely care about. And so I would prefer 40k didn't end up in a TV serial situation where anytime a character dies or disappears, even with some heavy sense of closure, it still doesn't land as spectacularly as it otherwise might have, because we always know that there's an open door to them coming back at some point. We can always rationalize. You can pretty much rationalize anything in 40k. But even though we can, there has to be some sense of awareness to this being balanced against the stability of the broader narrative world. Would I like to see Malcador coalesce Would I like to see him explode in the middle of the throne room like some 40k Dr. Manhattan returning to team up with Gilliman? Maybe the Sigillite even helps restore or work toward restoring the Emperor, launching a huge investigation, becoming the head of the Inquisition, unifying all of those things. I mean, a part of me would like to see that, yeah, that sounds quite epic. But there are endless possible character pathways for pretty much anybody in 40k. Deep down inside, I would still probably say no, because I know that the bottom line is it would undermine the whole story. It would undermine, say, Malcador's sacrifice, the weight of his sacrifice, and that's not the way to go. In the contemporary Imperium, the heresy is long gone. It's 10,000 years. Let's keep things moving forward. If anything, do what I was talking about the other day, do the apostasy. There's so much you could get into there. And that's why we need some big new things to drag us out and away from this endless Primarch Astartes cycle. It's not to suggest that any characters could not return. It's not to suggest that Space Marines aren't epic and we can still get great stories there. But can we at least keep it to those that are a bit more plausible first? Vulcan being the most obvious choice. It's far more reasonable and narratively not jarring for Vulcan to return. He's already done so many times, and he has a perfectly cleanly established mechanic for doing so. Vulcan returning would be no issue whatsoever. But Dorn? What's he gonna do? Build some more walls? I'm joking, sit down, Fists fans. But if Dorn does return, what are we doing now? Just taking off all sane guardrails and going all in? Let's go, full 80s action movie 40k, let's get back all the Primarchs. It's Heresy 2, baby. Clone Grim, Clone Manus, Clone Horus. It's Fabius versus Gilliman. Let's go!
Payback time.
And look, we all know that part of engaging with lore, I guess broadly, but especially in something as sprawling and chaotic as 40k, is speculation. That's part of the fun. I know some people are not here for that, and that's 100% fine. But for me, speculation is part of the discipline of lore exploration, because we never know everything. It's kind of like the POV of the Mechanicus. They think everything already exists and is out there, but you just have to find it and arrange it all carefully to make it work. And that's kind of, an enjoyable thing to be doing. Another analogy, you could say, and I always think about this one, a large jigsaw puzzle. There are some pieces you want to just try out. You want to see if they fit, especially if there's no obvious immediate place for it. Where can it go? Where might it go? Other pieces you can see clearly right from the start. They've only got one place to sit. They're not going to fit anywhere else unless you force them in, even if they look like they should go there. But the problem is, if you do force them in, they're going to forever damage and leave an empty hole somewhere else that can only be filled by then forcing something else in that would also damage the pieces adjacent to it. And I think that works quite well, because lore is not just about story, it's about discussion and engagement. You form theories of your own, you interact with those of others, you rationalize, you fill in the gaps. You're trying to make sense of a world which thrives on mystery and propaganda and outright contradiction. And I've always said things can change whether you like it or not. That's just the nature of the 40k verse. I've known that ever since I was 11 years old, rereading the rulebooks and the early White Dwarves that were my entire entry point for 40k. Because the lore shifts around, some things are not clear, narratives evolve, even the dreaded Mrkrons appear and happen. That's just the nature of the void. And as with anything, just because we can acknowledge that this is so, it doesn't mean you have to be happy about it, which I think I've been pretty consistent about. Because at the end of the day though, 40k is what it is. It's a massive, absurd, incredibly over-the-top setting where nearly anything can happen, which is why I love it. Because as much as I approach things from this dry, some would say more serious, if you want to call it that, view, I really love still the insane madness of it. Orcs having a weapon that's basically just an explosive strapped to a stick that they smash at things, often destroying themselves in the process. Or what about, Letao being presented as a serious contender to the galaxy when clearly they're on the brink of annihilation at pretty much any moment, or the Tyranids being this very existential threat. But wait, not too much, because, you You've got reality-breaking psychers, demons who exist outside all material boundaries, and even though it makes me sick to my stomach, yes, sadly even sometimes a bit of time travel shenanigans. Plus the all too familiar favourite of mine, planetary invasions featuring, checks notes, thousands of guardsmen and a few Astartes, which, to be fair, they've sort of started to realise is silly, and I've seen it scale up the numbers a bit, but it remains this persistent bit of nonsense, and I'm sure that we're still going to get further things which slip through the cracks in that regard. But this immersion-breaking chaos just exists in the verse. It is, again, what it is. But I enjoy it still, even when it does make my skin prickly with irritation. But 40k has never been about being right or wrong, to the point at which nearly everybody I know in 40k tabletop players, everybody I know in real life related to 40k, including lore nerds and so on, you just joke about it endlessly, because that's what it's all about. Because as much as you might want it to be true, that 40k are this tightly plotted, hard sci-fi epic, where every reference, every piece of material allows you to draw a tight line to an upcoming event, you want to define every element as having canonicity or not. It doesn't work that way, and it won't. Screaming about it or pointing fingers won't help either, because you're pretty much just screaming into the void then. And everybody understands in the lore space, the cold reality, that for as much as 40k exists as a stage for its own narrative, it very much exists to help and further the production of the 40k tabletop game. And it's always comical to me that people will often leave comments to that effect, but phrased as if they've uncovered some master plan, a mystery that nobody was aware of until now. We all know, everybody knows, we all have known this forever. And I've said it on so many videos now that those two things are inextricably linked. I don't think it's a good thing either, but it is, again, what it is. And even while I wish it were true that the lore stood separate, it's just unlikely. And therefore, while grating it may be, it's ever just important to temper your expectations accordingly. And that brings me back to my overarching thought here, which is, do we really need to relitigate situations that have already played out? No, in my opinion. Will it still happen? Probably. In fairness, Star Wars basically already did that, and everything worked out perfectly. Oh. Well, it was different with the Star Trek Picard series though, because they decided to bring back the best characters, and they still managed to create an amazing new story that kept the best part. Oh. So yeah, despite 40k being this mad, almost anything goes world, I'd personally take a hard pass when we start drifting into soap opera territory, or if you will, the return of Dirty Dorn. That's an EastEnders reference for you. And, maybe Dorn will come back, but with a bout of explosive amnesia to boot. I'm probably being overdramatic and worried. It'll all be fine and worthwhile, because remember how 2 years ago now, remember when the Lion came back? And remember how that was really important that happened? Because remember how the Lion led that epic campaign and it was really significant? And then remember how the Lion went and met up with Guilliman and there was that amazing interaction between them which revealed like a whole new era of 40k, and it saw them lay out specific plans for how to restructure, rebuild, fortify the Imperium against its worst enemies. Oh yeah, none of that happened. And then they just did nothing with the Lion. And the Lion wasn't even a controversial return. Anyway, as with all things 40k, I could ramble on. This has definitely been a more ramble video, I know, I'm sorry. I could ramble on for days about this stuff. The TLDR is, let's speculate, sure. Let's theorize, let's pick things apart. I live for all that kind of stuff. But let's also recognize that when we're going in circles, when we're beating a dead, pun intended, horse, maybe we can just consider leaving some things in the past, which I would argue is where they belong. Because I really don't want to have to make more stuff like this, where I have to go back to previous videos, cut out a section of what I said and clip it in here, just to highlight what I've already said. But I will reiterate that for the reasons I've covered today and previously, I still believe that Dorn does more good by staying dead, caveat for now. It could all change, but a vision of a Templar who may or may not have been manipulated by a trait of Primarch doesn't convince me. /discuss